So you can hear that. Once upon a time, I was the state director of the Indiana Christian Coalition. I have a master's in public affairs. I've been a lobbyist. My first job out of graduate school, I worked for the Indiana legislature as staff doing management audits of state agencies and have done various things. And then back in the early 2000s, I kind of transitioned into teaching. So I teach economics, political science, statistics, believe it or not. I also teach public relations and e-commerce for Indiana Tech. So I'm sort of a jack of many trades and a master of none. I have some courses that I've created out there. John, I think, has taken one. It's called How to Teach Online. And I'm presently working on another course called How to Teach with Technology Online. So just as you all have gotten used to Zoom and things of that nature, I teach for two different high schools, dual credit with Ivy Tech. So I have a total of 4 classes at 2 different high schools. And since the middle of March, we went on to Zoom. And so I would usually have 15, 16 students on at any one time. So I've been learning a lot about how to manage this whole technology thing. Back in 2017, I wrote this book that you should, do you all see that there in the screen? John says he can see it. Yeah, oh, by the way, thumbs up, thumbs down is a really good way, or if you're not sure, sideways is just fine if you want to indicate something that way. But I wrote this book, The Unraveling of We the People, back in 2017. And so what I've been doing ever since is going to Tea Party groups like yours to do live presentations. Obviously, this is the first one that I have done online. And so one of the predicates of this, I have a daughter who was a missionary surgeon with Samaritan's Purse, and she was in Zambia, Africa. She came home in the fall of 2015 with stage 4 breast cancer, and she passed in January of 2016. And so the foreword to the book is about a conversation Sarah and I had when she was a junior in high school. And she said to me one time, "Dad, it says on our money, 'In God we trust,' so why don't we?" And so this book is sort of my answer to my daughter's question from all those years ago. And so one of the things that I like to start with is by saying is that at a moment in time when we all are facing a looming fiscal cliff, and now that we've spent God knows how many trillions of dollars on the pandemic, we're in the neighborhood of 25, 26 trillion dollars in debt. But at a point in time when we're facing this massive looming fiscal cliff, we are asking ourselves, who are we as a people? What does it mean to be an American? And certainly for those of us looking at you all, you're all about my age. And so we're of a certain age, and we're saying, what happened to the country we grew up in? And so that's the sort of thing, the sense that I get from people when I talk to folk. I teach statistics, and usually when you have some sort of a test that you want to do, you have to have a standard to measure against. And so a standard that I like to point out is George Washington's inaugural address, in which he said that the foundations of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality. So that's sort of the starting point for us as Americans, the fact that we have this idea. And so now our minds are shaped and transformed. Uh-oh, that's not good. Let me see if, I don't know if you heard that, but it said the recording has stopped. So I didn't do that on purpose. So let's see, do you want to stop? No, I don't want to stop it. So hopefully it'll keep on recording. I don't know exactly. So we'll see. There we go. We'll see whether or not my personal Wi-Fi can handle 2 video chats at the same time. But at any rate, what we read and what we experience kind of transforms our minds and shapes our character. So John, you might want to unmute them. I have a community trivia question here. I'm going to mention 2 phrases, one from 2 different television shows. I want you all to see if you can complete the phrase. So make sure that your microphones are unmuted. and hopefully there's not a ton of background noise, but I'm going to start a phrase and somebody please complete this for me. Look, up in the sky.
It's a bird.
Bird,
It's
it's a plane.
It's Superman.
Okay, very good. That was the Adventures of Superman were on for 4 seasons back in the 1950s. Now, I've got another phrase. I'm going to start it. You see if you can complete it. It seems today that all we see is violence in movies and sex on TV. That's from the cartoon series Family Guy, which has been on television for 18 seasons.
I don't want that.
Well, I don't either, but a lot of young people do. So you can go back to muting your phones. But the reason that I like to throw that out is to demonstrate that there's a shift that's happening in terms of morality, the things that we feel are acceptable and not acceptable. We all have experienced that, and we know that that's true, but sometimes having an illustration like that helps for us to see that. So one of the things that I like to talk about is that we need to get back to teaching traditional civics. And I want to take just a moment to explain what I mean by that. First of all, as you all would expect, it's a knowledge of the history of our nation and the philosophical foundation upon which our nation is based. The second would be a knowledge of how our laws are passed and one's role as a citizen. And I think most everybody would get those first two. But there's a third one that I think only a small percentage of our people would get. And that is that civics is about the creation of an inner moral virtue by which you can govern your emotional passions. I don't know about you guys, but when I was growing up and I'd get a report card, there was basically a citizen grade. Was I being a good student? Was I behaving? Now, my mother was an English teacher, and there were a couple of times when I basically got read the riot act when I came back to find out that I was not behaving as somebody felt I should be. And so if you're into the Bible, then in Philippians 1:27, Paul talks about conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And that word conduct, the Greek word, I'm going to butcher this terribly, is poliutse. It is the word from which we get the English word politics. And so this idea of right conduct is a political thing in terms of how we learn to get along with other members of our society. And that's been a foundational teaching of Christianity and the moral virtues in terms of civics education. And so, in fact, sometime when you have time, Google the 1828 Webster's Dictionary definition of politics. You can do that probably while I'm talking. And if you do, then you all can share your reaction a little bit later on when I open it up for conversation. But Google that 1828 Webster's Dictionary of Politics. It'll come up. You'll type in a word, type in the word politics, read what the definition is. It'll blow your mind, I think, given what we see today. Well, you probably all know about the McGuffey readers that came out in 1836. But there's a guy by the name of Lincoln Mullen. He's a researcher at the George Mason, it's either George Washington University or George Mason University. And he got very interested in looking at Bible quotes, Bible scriptures being reported in the newspapers around the country. The reason being is because for the year 1876, he saw the Bible verse of 1 Samuel 3:4 popping up in the newspapers across the country. And he said, well, what's going on? Well, come to find out, that was the election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, and Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. By the way, there's a guy by the name of Thomas Henderson. And how many of you have been to the State House downtown Indianapolis? Okay, 1. Okay, so 2. In the southeast corner of the lawn of the State House building, there's this tall statue of a guy named, I believe it's Thomas Henderson. He was Samuel Tilden's vice presidential running mate in 1876. And so that verse, 1 Samuel 3:4 says, then the Lord called Samuel and he answered, here I am. Now think about this. 1876, who all is going to know what a Bible verse says? Well, frankly, a lot of Americans, because they knew their Bible. And so Samuel Tilden was using that verse sort of the way we would use a bumper sticker today in a political campaign. And this really got this researcher, Lincoln Mullen, interested. And he found out that, throughout America, the prominent pastors of the communities would have their sermons published in the local newspaper. There would even be crossword puzzles based on Bible verses and things of that nature. And so not just when people were young, but when they were old, they were infused with a knowledge of the scripture. Now, being human beings and sinful people, we don't all apply that, but at least they knew that. Even Lincoln says that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom in his Gettysburg Address. And in fact, if you've ever wondered about the history of how we got the words under God into the pledge, a pastor by the name of George Doherty gave a sermon on the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birthday. So that would have been either 1952 or 1954. And he titled it Under God because his 7-year-old son, he was an immigrant from Scotland. His 7-year-old son comes home, recites the Pledge of Allegiance. He says, what's different between that and what would be in the Soviet Union? And then he realized it was under God, this nation shall know a rebirth of liberty, and under God was the definitive character of the American way of life. And so he said that in the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. He gave that sermon. Eisenhower was sitting in the Lincoln pew that morning, and within 3 months, the Congress had basically amended the Pledge of Allegiance to include the words under God in the pledge. And so that's how that came about. So with all of that as background, you might say, what happened to civics education in America? And so what happened was that there were a lot of reforms. You've probably heard of John Dewey. When I teach political science to my really young students, I basically I remind them that John Dewey is the guy that came up with the Dewey Decimal System. And to be quite honest, for a good portion of my life, that's about all I knew about him, quite frankly, and that's the way Americans view him too. But if you've done some research, then you know that he was very active in the progressive movement and very interested in reform of education. He wanted to dismiss the teachings of history and the building of virtuous character through teaching history. He thought history was a waste of time. He also wanted to get Christianity out of the public schools. And also, he felt that moral character education was not worth it. And so under his movement and the accolades that followed after him, they worked to get rid of moral character education. And they wanted to also redefine the focus of social studies to be more in line what was going on in the new Soviet Union in the 1920s and so forth, saying that that's the way the world needs to go, and so we should be more like the Soviet Union with regard to our education policies. In fact, there was a 1934 commission on how the social studies are taught that revamped everything about how we teach social studies, and several of the principal authors of that were accolades of Dewey, and they also wanted to promote the various efforts of the Soviet style of education. Now, there was a guy by the name of George Counts who was a socialist, spent time in the Soviet Union, was one of the people that helped to write that study on how to teach the social studies. He and John Dewey were on the dissertation committee for a guy by the name of Norman Woelfel, who wrote his PhD. And in 1933, the worst year ever of the Great Depression, 25% unemployment in 1933, his dissertation was turned into a book that had 3 printings. Can you imagine having a PhD that people would want to read so much that would have 3 printings? I can't imagine that sort of thing. These days, PhDs are dull reading. I don't have a PhD. John, do you?
I have a Doctor of Education degree, but my dissertation is pretty dull reading too. I can guarantee you that.
So probably not going to get 3 readings. So it gets 3 readings. And so I actually own a copy of this book. And in the book, I want to read you a statement that comes from the book. What Wolfel did was he interviewed like 17 experts on education theory, both conservative and liberal. And at the conclusion, one of the recommendations is as follows. The things of highest value for individual experience and for ethical standards in modern America will not, however, be found out so long as intellectual leaders maintain a sensitivity over the supernatural significance of Christian mythology or a sentimental personal attachment to the character of Jesus. And so that's the way these folks viewed all of that. Now, many people went through the education process under the philosophy that was being promoted by Dewey and his accolades. And it shouldn't be surprising to you that probably several people who ended up on the federal judiciary were among those students, including a guy by the name of Hugo Black. Hugo Black was the guy who introduced the concept of a wall of separation between church and state in the case Everson versus Board of Education in 1947. Now, that didn't go forward in the majority opinion, but 15 years later, in 1962, in the case that removed prayer in school, it's known as Engel versus Vitale, Hugo Black wrote the majority opinion in terms of removing prayer from school. And in his biography, his daughter is quoted by saying, quote, Black acknowledged the influence of John Dewey's functional approach. My daughter has frequently told people that if they want to find out what I think, they should go to Dewey's works. And so this idea that Christianity should be removed from public education, that we don't want to teach history, that we want to basically learn by doing, and I don't have anything against learning by doing, but that was principally the only way that Dewey wanted to teach. All those things, getting character education out of the public schools, ends up educating, among others, a Supreme Court justice of the United States bench. And so we see those ideas begin to move in. And so the disciples of Dewey and other progressive educationists began to sow the seeds of Marxist thinking. And so the progressives believed we don't need God. We can perfect ourselves. All we have to do is apply science. And certainly this week, we've probably heard some conversations about people saying we need to apply science in decisions about how we deal with the pandemic and things of that nature. And so that's where these sorts of things begin to come. Now, there's a guy by the name of Charles Murray, and he has written several books. I'm a big fan of his. One of the books that he wrote is called Coming Apart. And in fact, it is from that book that I borrow a phrase he uses where he talks about the American system unraveling. But he said that there were 4 founding virtues: honesty, industriousness, marriage, and religion. And so essentially, those are the pillars that uphold our society. But over time, those foundations have been undercut and are unraveling. And so consequently, our society, at least as we know it, as we grew up to experience it, is unraveling. And so instead of individual rights endowed by a creator, now we've got the United Nations and other organizations dispensing rights under their own authority, making, among other things, a universal declaration of human rights and things of that nature. And if you follow those sorts of things, then you know that there's a branch of the legal profession that wants to incorporate things from the United Nations instead of the U.S. Constitution into the legal jurisprudence of our country. A watershed event that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is the Great Depression. There is an author that I've read only one of her books. Her name is Amity Shales, and she wrote a book called The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression. Has anybody ever read or heard of that book? So if you're into heavy reading, put it down, The Forgotten Man by Amity Shales. And what she does in that book is she bases it off of an essay that was written in the late 1800s that talked about the forgotten man. And I want to spend just a moment to explain what this concept is. Imagine 2 rich people, rich man A and rich man B, and they see a poor guy over here, poor man C. And they basically say, you know, we need to do something to help Mr. C out. I know, let's pass some sort of a program that will provide food and income to that man, and the taxpayers will pay for it. After all, we are a culture that believes in taking care of our brother and sister in need. So we should basically put that on the taxpayer's role. Well, who pays the tax? The person who pays the tax is Mr. X, the forgotten man. Now, Mr. X is barely above the poverty level. He has a job. It's not a great job, but he has a job. And he's the one that is taxed to pay for Mr. C's problem. Now, during FDR's administration, he came along and he co-opted the forgotten man syndrome. But essentially what he did was he removed Mr. X completely and put him in the place of Mr. C. So now we forget about the individual that is just above the poverty line, who's got a job where he's living paycheck to paycheck. Instead, it's all about the recipient of the welfare. And that's how the system evolved, and Amity Shales does a wonderful job of laying that out in her book. And so now today, we have fatherless sons who are being raised, who instead of learning to work hard to earn a living, are instead being taught to put their hand out and ask for a handout. And perhaps you've noticed that you've got blue states that want to put a hand out and have another $3 trillion if Nancy Pelosi gets her way, versus the red states who are saying, you know, we have a rainy day fund. We planned ahead of time. How come you all didn't do that? And so those are the situations that we find facing ourselves today. And in fact, another book that Charles Murray wrote called American Losing Ground, American Social Policy, 1950 to 1980, he traces the effect of the welfare system that led principally to out-of-wedlock childbirth, so that the percentage of children born out of wedlock was less than 7% back in 1964 and was a little over 40% by the year 2008. And so that's where we see a lot of what I'll call societal dysfunction happening because of single parent households. This is not to disparage, hardworking, God-fearing men and women that are single parents raising kids, but out of millions and millions of households, you can imagine what's going on, and that's one of the reasons why our society is coming apart. So Alexis de Tocqueville, in his book Democracy in America, talks about the idea of equality. And essentially, one of the things that he says is that democracy seeks equality and liberty, but that socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude. And so has anybody ever heard of the phrase a melting pot? Okay, so we're familiar with that. But have you heard of the new phrase called the salad bowl? So today's new phrase for how society integrates is the salad bowl. Now, I don't know about you, but I really don't like onions on my salad. So if you put onions on them, I'm going to discriminate and take them off. And also, I don't like cheese. So if you put cheese on my salad, I'm going to discriminate and take them off because they're separate and they're distinct. I can identify them, and I'm going to discriminate against cheese and onions. You may have certain items that you discriminate against, but which I love. Now, we can have an argument about what's the best toppings on the salad, but essentially, if you think about it, that's the society in which we live now. We're all about our little tribes, our racial or ethnic divides. And so now, instead of being a melting pot where e pluribus unum, out of many one, now we have a divergent setup where that happens. You wouldn't know it just looking at me, but I'm 50% of an interracial marriage. My wife is Chinese. And so I talk about this sort of thing and when I get confronted over this issue. And I said, well, you know, my two older kids are fluent in Spanish, and they've been mistaken for Hispanics. I don't have that problem, but they do. And in fact, my youngest son, he said, I asked him one time, I said, Josh, have you ever suffered from discrimination? He said, Yes, but not in a way that you would recognize, Dad. I said, oh, really? What do you mean? He says, well, I'm Chinese and everybody thinks I'm smart. Think about that. So these are things that, we all recognize are happening. I live in an e pluribus family. And so I have the blessing of that. And so forth. So we've now devolved into class warfare, fighting for equality, and so this melting pot has changed over into something called a salad bowl. And so de Tocqueville feared that the demand for equality would lead to this thing that he called democratic despotism, seeking social control via centralized bureaucracy. And if you think about it, that's one of the things that we're seeing in this battle about should we be allowed to go back to work, or should we hunker down and shelter in place? And God forbid that you should go out of your house, because then I might fine you, I might put you in jail, depending on what city or state you live in. And so these are some of the issues that we're facing. And he also said, de Tocqueville also said that democracy requires firm religious commitments, which would curb individualism's worst excesses. And so those are some of the things that we see. So you might say, Mr. Lance, we should teach civics, right? And so these are the things that, if you're a Tea Party member, somebody of the religious right, what you would say, well, this is a no-brainer. However, that's not what the progressives mean when they talk about civics education. So you might remember Bill Ayers. This is a picture when he was with the Weatherman Underground, but now he is the Distinguished Professor of Education and Senior University Scholar at the University of Illinois at Chicago, retired. He has spent his academic career writing about civics education. However, what he's writing about is not what you and I might recognize. Instead, he's teaching people how to become revolutionaries, maybe join up with Antifa, get funding from George Soros, and go and protest, blow things up, burn things, sort of like what he did in the 1960s. And so at the time that I was working on the book, I came across a gentleman by the name of David Randolph with the National Academy of Scholars. And they had just come out with a book called Making Citizens. And their focus was on this liberal agenda that was essentially creating a new civics that claims the name of civics, but is really a form of anti-civics, teaching people to overwhelm the system, to become activists, to protest, maybe get funding from George Soros and things of that nature. And so that was, for me, a very good God moment when I came across a fellow researcher who had similar interests, and we did a lot of collaboration. I spent a lot of hours emailing him and even talked to him on the phone once or twice. He's in Washington, D.C. And so there are people out there who think like us. Now, as I mentioned, I teach e-commerce for one of the schools that I teach for. And there's something that I'll call the viral loop. So you've probably engaged in this. You've probably seen something on the internet, Facebook, Twitter, what have you, and you liked it. So you liked it, and then you said, I'm going to share that. So then you shared it. And then other people saw it, they liked it, and they shared it too. And so now think of this, they always talked about the best sort of publicity is word of mouth. Well, that's before social media. And so this viral loop concept is today's word of mouth. And so there are various people out there that have learned to leverage that. George Soros has the Open Society Foundation. And so he has what's called the Center for Public Integrity. Arianna Huffington is on the board for Center for Public Integrity. She and Jonah Peretti co-founded the Huffington Post. Now, there are websites that you can go out there that analyze and track which websites for a variety of topics have the largest following. Huffington Post is the #1 website on the internet for political news. The #1 viral sharing platform is BuzzFeed, which Jonah Peretti founded after he helped Arianna Huffington found the Huffington Post. So if you were to talk to somebody, say 35 years of age or younger, And if you were to ask them if they recognize a news source, and this was certainly true in my son Josh, who is now 33, he recognized the name Huffington Post. It's not surprising. They have 110 million unique visitors to their website every month. I just said 110 million unique. That's different visitors every month. And so the way that traffic comes is BuzzFeed shows a little, it's kind of like the Drudge Report for liberals. And so BuzzFeed will show a link, a tagline, a picture, and you click it and you go get the entire story there at Huffington Post. So think of a funnel that funnels, from a large number of people down more and more to more focused information. Now, certainly some people fall out of this funnel, but a certain number of them begin to say, hey, that's true. And now one of the things that liberals are doing, and I suppose conservatives too, is they don't make it available online to figure out who is funding these various things. It takes some digging. You can find out, but you've got to do some digging. And so my book, what I have tried to do this evening is to give a quick overview of the main high points. But I have a thesis. The first point is that a concerted effort began in the 1920s to remove the moral teachings of Christianity and the principle of economic self-reliance. Then during the 1960s, you saw a generation that despised Christianity and proclaimed sex, drug, and rock and roll that is now today risen to power in many elements of government and academia. And then third, they are now in a position to promote this new civics that undermines our traditional form of constitutional government and faith in God. So those are the things that are going on. And so logically, the question might be, what should we do? Well, I've thought about this. There are 4 obstacles that we have. One is what I'll call the long tail effect. If you can imagine cracking a whip, but imagine instead of the whip only being, say, 9 feet long, it's, 2,000 miles long. It's going to take some time for that ripple to go from your wrist where you snap the whip to the tip of the whip. It's going to take some time. And so this is called the long tail effect. I might have a lot of information, which it's very difficult for me to get to Tom, Dick, and Harry way out there at the end of it, because there's so much interference in between me and the ultimate recipient of the information. And so it takes a while to educate people. And of course, by the time they get educated, things have changed, the players have moved on, etc. Second, teachers of traditional civics feel isolated. Now, as an adjunct instructor, I've used the phrase that I feel like I teach from a silo. I know what I'm doing. I don't know what the other adjuncts at other places are doing. When I get together once or twice a year with my fellow adjuncts, then I get to discover how conservative I am compared to everybody else. And I've been told by students throughout the years that I am a breath of fresh air because I'm virtually the only conservative instructor they come in contact with. A third issue, therefore, is that conservative academic class is not very proactive. I joined up with the American Enterprise Institute's Values and Capitalism Project. In fact, the way the book got started was I responded to a solicitation for papers. I wrote a paper on the general thesis of what the book became. I didn't expect to get selected, and I didn't, but I refer to them as the Wine and Cheese Club, who love to talk about ideas, but they're not Tea Party folk. You'd never see them at a Tea Party rally because that's not their thing. And finally, the grassroots activists, of which you're members of. I know you've got your leaders locally, but on a national basis, we're kind of leaderless, if you think about it. And so those are some challenges that we face. So one of the things that can be done, in fact, if you know Micah Clark with the American Family Institute of Indiana, Micah and I are good friends. And so I've worked with him over the years, and we finally got a bill through the Indiana legislature to require that the same test that new immigrants who want to become citizens of the country must pass, that has to be administered to high school students. Now, they took out the wording that requires that they pass the test. They got a bill passed last session that is going to require the Indiana Department of Education to report what the results will be. So probably in the next year or two, we'll find about that. Another thing is I call LEAD. which is learn to master the iron of the culture, that is technology, to engage the culture using technology, and to associate with other conservatives and disciple others to engage the culture. So if you go to my website, it's wisejargon.com, and then you'll see something called political and economic leadership. Then I've got something called economics down on the farm. So if you're familiar with the book Animal Farm, so I've taken Animal Farm concepts and I created what I call barnyard economics. So I have the characters from Animal Farm discussing economic concepts that I use to teach in my econ courses. Now, one of the things I mentioned, I have courses that I'm creating, and one that I'm creating is how to teach with technology online. Eventually, I'll get that done. I'll provide information about that to John, and he can share it with the rest of you. Usually, these courses are between $10 and $20, so they're not a lot of money. But I want to encourage you to think about how you can use things like PowerPoint, YouTube, things of that nature, which I'm going to demonstrate how to do, to then create what I'll call edutainment videos to teach about American history and things that you know something about. Another thing to think about, and this is a website you want to write down. It's called openthebooks.com. Openthebooks.com. What the guy who runs it, I think his name is Alex is his first name, and his last name is, for me, it's unpronounceable, so I won't even try. But he is in the state of Illinois, and he has basically taken a lot of time to build up a database where he accesses the federal government's budget as well as the state budgets of most of the 50 states, including some of the major cities across the country, so that he can dive down into the city, the state, and the federal government to look at how they spend our money. Now, one of the things that some other folks in the state have been involved with is this idea of comprehensive sex education, which is abysmal if you follow that topic at all. Well, a question you might ask is, how are they paying for sex education? Are they getting, say, Planned Parenthood materials and things of that nature? Using openthebooks.com, likely, if you drill down, you can get information on how that's going. So if you're looking for a project that your Tea Party could do there in Madison County, I would encourage you to think about this one. And so another thing that you can also do is you can do what are called FOIA requests. That's Freedom of Information Act requests. So let's say that you found some information, but you wanted more information. Now you can write a FOIA request under the open door laws to gather information about things. And then also, I talk about creating open source library lesson plans. You know, one of the things that we all on the conservative side of things can do is do a better job of sharing information. There are conservative teachers out there. Remember, I mentioned we're all in our little foxholes. So if you think of a prairie dog that sticks its head out of its little hole every now and then to see who else is out there, we need to do a better job of connecting. Because my feeling is that we don't do a very good job. We're all stuck in our little foxholes, and we don't get out there and see what else is going on and how we can cross-pollinate with ideas. And so connecting with people and organizations is something that we need to do. Last thing to mention, and then I'll shut up and we can answer any questions you might have. I have a website, wisejargon.com. Since 2005, I've been writing a monthly publication I call Conversations with the Culture. So if your church has a youth or college group, I've done over 150 movies and TV shows over the years where I create a Bible study based on a scene from a popular movie. And I'm now creating anthologies that I call Discovering Truth at the Movies. So I take a compilation of anywhere from 10 to 15 movies on a given theme. So it's usually, for example, it's discovering raising Daniels and Esther's at the movies, discovering the courage of Jeremiah at the movies. I even did an overview of C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, and the anthology is titled Discovering Mere Christianity at the Movies. So you can go to that website, check it out, see what you think, and go from there. And then, of course, my book, The Unraveling of We the People, you can go to theunraveling.us. It's on ebook on Kindle. If you want a hard copy, there's a PayPal button there on the website. You can order it, and then it'll notify me, and I'll send you the book. So, John, That's all I've got in terms of prepared remarks, and happy to answer any questions the group might have.
Well, excuse me, that's pretty good, David. And I want to thank you for everything you're doing with teaching and promoting civics education and the Constitution and conservative values. This has been a powerful, information-packed presentation, so I do thank you.
Thank you.
Um, if any others have, there were no questions posted in the chat window, but if others
I have a question, John.
Mike has a question. Let's hear
Sure,
it,
Mike.
David, of these classes that you teach throughout sounds like high school, college, both, what kind of feedback are you getting from the students about the learning that you're teaching them compared to their home life? What kind of answers are you getting there?
That's a very good question. I appreciate you asking that. I recently was teaching at Decatur High School, which is on the southwest corner of Indianapolis, and I had two classes with approximately 55 students. And trust me, in this day and age, the vast majority of kids in this age group think that same-sex marriage is a perfectly acceptable thing and things of that nature. And I don't get into arguments about that sort of thing. But what I value is I had a young man who was basically my go-to Democrat. So every week when we were having class face-to-face, I would say, what happened in politics this week? And the young man would give us the lowdown on what was going on from a Democratic point of view. And he emailed me at the end of the course and he said, Mr. Lance, I really enjoyed your class. I've never been anywhere where I felt I could express my ideas without fear of creating, a fight or things of that nature. And I had another student who actually, I live on a cul-de-sac, and one of my students babysits the three munchkins across the street from me. And she said to me, I skipped out on my other Ivy Tech professors' Zoom meetings, but I always attended yours. So the answer to your question, Mike, is that I think that they really enjoyed it. I have every semester, I have a couple of students that sign up for my Facebook page and things of that nature. And I've had students at another high school where I've been teaching for a while, and now I'm having younger brothers and sisters come through the system. And one young lady told me that her older brother is at Rolls-Holman now and wishes that I was a professor there. So it's nice to get, it's a warm, fuzzy feeling to get that sort of thing. I teach between my online classes for University of Phoenix, Indiana Wesleyan, and everything else. I probably touch 750 students in a 12-month period.
Thank you.
David, I'm on your email list and I get your Conversations with Culture email.
Very good.
How can people on this Zoom meeting get on your email list?
Essentially, if you go to let me back up here. If you go to Wise, can you guys still see the thing? So it's wisejargon.com/@the-movies. And if you scroll down that page, there's a sign up form that you'll see.
Okay.
In fact, anybody here on the call familiar with the movie The Matrix? Okay, so you're probably familiar with the scene which is called the red pill or the blue pill.
Yeah.
Where Morpheus offers the red pill, and he says, if you take the red pill, I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth. And then it's a meme. And so there's a picture of him holding out the pills, and you can see Neo in the reflection of his sunglasses. And then at the bottom caption, I have, oh, by the way, you'll also have to be born again. Now, if you're a real Matrix movie aficionado, you'll know that as soon as Neo takes the red pill, his physical body comes out of this incubator into a pool of water, and it's like he's being born again. And so right underneath that is the sign-up form.
Okay, thank you. I have another question for you, David. Are you at all familiar with the work that Richard Dreyfuss is doing with civics?
I am, so here's a liberal professor who feels the same thing, that, people need to learn civics. Now, I don't know for a fact that he would go towards the moral character aspect of civics. He might, but certainly the first two, in terms of understanding how our system of government works and things of that nature. And I'm so thankful that there's people like him, probably from the Democrat liberal side of politics, who also sees the same problem that we face. Because
Yeah.
without that sort of education, we lose a sense of who we are as a nation.
Yeah, and I'm a very strong conservative, but I really think that our society functions best when the liberals and the conservatives get together and work together for common goals, and make compromises that are in the best interest of all the people,
Yes.
not just what rhinos do when they compromise and they
Yeah,
make
we don't
compromises.
always have to come at each other with swords drawn. We can actually
So
get together and play a good game of a fun game of basketball. That's what
yeah,
Hoosiers do.
so so anyway, for everybody listening, if you want to learn about that, you can go to the dreyfusinitiative.org, and I put that in the chat a minute ago. The dreyfusinitiative.org, and you can sign up and be part of what Richard Dreyfuss is trying to do, with civics education.
Yeah.
Any other
Very good.
questions from anybody? Joni, I see that Adam is Joni's son. He joined us. Or Brenda, any questions from anybody else? Crickets.
Well, it might be dinner time too for some people. I don't know.
Okay. Joni, I saw your mouth moving, but I didn't hear anything. Did you have a question? No? Okay. Well, David, thank you very much. And we got this done in less than an hour.
All
And
right.
you'll process the recording and send it to me, and I'll make it available to all of our Madison County Tea Party members.
Will do. Well, everybody, thanks so much for your time. And here's another thought to throw out for you all. On that same page, there's a button you can click to ask for information about me as a speaker. I'm happy to come to a church and talk about things. I have another book called Think Like Jesus, Lead Like Moses, which is a in-depth study of looking at leadership in terms of 10 lessons from the life of Moses, applied to myself when I was the head of the Christian Coalition. So I have other topics and things that love to share about. And for me, a church is a good group to come and visit,
Okay.
especially
Thank
if
you,
there's a potluck involved.
Maybe someday we can get back to doing that in our churches.
All
Okay.
righty. Well, everybody, thanks so much for your time and have a wonderful evening, and God bless.
Okay. Good night, everybody.